Hi everyone, glad you can make it today. My name is Carson Poling. Today we're going to be discussing port infrastructure and commodity access in particular. I'm an associate here at REMI. I'm joined by Ying, David, and Jeff. If you guys want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, hello everyone. I'm Ying. I'm an analyst at REMI. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm Jeff Dykes. I'm an analyst as well at REMI, and excited to be here today.
Hi everybody, I'm David Gasaza. I'm associate at REMI.
Great. So first on the agenda, we're going to be, doing a quick overview of ports, what their, often cited direct economic impacts and demographic impacts are. If you're just doing a simple input-output model, simple analysis, what it would tell you, what you would find. And then we're going to discuss some of the harder to capture impacts of ports, such as the impact on commodity access, on trade, how are, is the entire region indirectly affected by, the existing port infrastructure, the services that the port provides. Then we're going to discuss the critical nature of economic modeling in that process of determining, where the resources of the port should be placed, what infrastructure should be built, what is the role of the port infrastructure in a community. We'll then discuss some of the previous REMI studies involving ports, which we've already conducted. And then we'll focus on a specific example and model demonstration involving the port of Savannah in Georgia. And then we'll move on to a Q&A. So, make sure if you have any, thoughts, if anything's confusing during any of this process, make sure to write it down and ask it to us then. So REMI was founded in the 1980s on the idea that government decision makers should be able to evaluate the economic impacts of policies before they're implemented. What if scenarios, if you will. We do dynamic economic impact analysis at the local, state, and national level. Everything from energy and environment policy to transportation and infrastructure, and as well as things like tax policy, broad economic development projects. And some of our clients include Texas Comptroller, the University of Michigan, TVA, North Carolina DOC, South Coast Air Quality Management District. So yeah, we operate across the country, at the state, national, and local level, as said earlier. And so in terms of analyzing the local economic impacts of ports employ thousands of workers in maintenance, freight, and shipping, as well as in construction. In addition, jobs in retail, human resources, and construction need to exist to support the work that ports do regionally. These thousands of additional workers, people will have to migrate to a region, live there, contribute to the tax revenue of a region, and the output of the region. So there's a significant direct positive impact on an economy through the existence of a port. We will later model an example of this, but even more critical is not just the number of construction jobs created through an infrastructure expansion, but how will that increase or affect commodity access. Ports allow entire regions, entire states to have cheaper access to goods, services, and other commodities. Thousands of additional jobs and industries can exist, that otherwise might not be able to exist. Factories like in, solar, battery technology, for example, in the state of Georgia, need port access in order to be viable and create those jobs and exist in a state. And furthermore, besides just cheaper imports, ports allow for a regional economy to better export their goods and their commodities to the international marketplace. So instead of just the direct couple thousand jobs created by a port. Ports actually allow for, tens of thousands of additional jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars in increased outputs throughout, the entire, state or region which the port operates and is located in. And ports are actually required to do a strategic or long-range plan, in their impact analysis to show, the impact of the port on the economy, not just now, but also, determine what their impact might be 30, 40, or 50 years down the line. And it's very critical to understand what industries exist currently and how that web of industries interweave and how that might change due to things such as new technologies, innovations, and such. And just raw construction and maintenance analysis, it is important, but it's insufficient to determine what industries will thrive. And so some form of dynamic impact analysis, 5, 10, 20, 50 years down the line is critical so that ports know what kind of infrastructure to invest in, where to put the money, what the impact is going to be, and so they don't, misinvest or underinvest in critical projects. So yeah, I'll turn it over to David to discuss past REMI port studies. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carson. So our interest in the economic ripple effects of ports on state economies comes in part from the fact that the REMI model has been used in a lot of different economic impact analyses for ports for a while. As you can see here, we've listed some of our example studies which have utilized the REMI model. And in every one, it shows just how many jobs and how many businesses, how much economic activity is really tied to the ports in various states. For example, from the Pacific Northwest study, which is, I think, fourth down, there were a bunch of different scenarios that were panned out, but it showed that a year-long shutdown would result in a loss of about 4.2% of jobs in the state of Washington and about 2% of jobs in the state of Oregon. In the San Diego port study, which was done for the San Diego Unified Port District, about 3.6% of the city of San Diego's jobs were directly reliant on the Port of San Diego, and about 4.4% of its output came directly from that port as well. And in Connecticut, according to the Connecticut Center for Economic Analysis, about 2% of statewide employees and 2.6% of the gross state product is tied to the state's ports. Now, most recently, the REMI model was utilized in the Mississippi DOT's analysis on the economic role of marine transportation in their state, and that was prepared by Cambridge Systematics. And we felt that besides the fact that this is a very recent study from 2019, the way it was laid out by Cambridge Systematics, it emphasized kind of our main point that the full benefits of a port in the state, specifically the ability to more directly export and import both final and intermediary goods to and from a global network, it isn't fully realized without proper analysis. So I'll go into some of the specifics of the MDOT study, which found 125,715 jobs were in some way dependent on Mississippi's ports. And from there, they were broken down into non-induced and induced jobs, which I'll get into here, exactly what that means. And from there, it was broken down into direct, dependent, and benefited jobs and businesses. So direct jobs are, it's very straightforward, are in marine transportation itself, so at the ports and the ships themselves. Port-dependent businesses are those that are most closely tied to the ports, as well as to access to global networks. And that included agriculture, seafood, oil and gas, petroleum and coal, chemical manufacturing, ship manufacturing, kind of going on from there. So highly industrialized. And then from there, they were also benefited businesses, which was less directly tied to the ports, but in some way benefited from the port being there. And that included automotive, concrete manufacturing, newspaper and media, actually, plastics and rubber, wood and paper, like electronics, and textiles. So of the total of about 125,000 jobs, about 67,000 of them fell under the induced category. This number of induced jobs was estimated with REMI's model, mostly tied to the input-output capabilities of REMI's model. It included any number of industries, could range anywhere from retail to real estate, basically just businesses and jobs that are there or benefit in some way from the fact that there is so much economic activity that is more directly tied to the port being there. So in total from this analysis, 10% of jobs in Mississippi are in some way benefiting from or reliant on the ports in the state, and 16% of Mississippi's GSP actually. So, and then in terms of separating those jobs that are more obviously tied to the ports of the state, and those that fall under this induced category, dividing up about 53% of the jobs in this study. So you can see the 67,060 induced jobs, and that takes up about 5% of total statewide jobs were found to be dependent on or benefiting from ports in some way. And this was found via REMI's model analysis. And these could have been missed or severely underestimated if a less kind of robust method of analysis wasn't utilized here. So with that in mind, we can bring our view to the Port of Savannah. I'll throw in some kind of numbers here. So the Port of Savannah is pretty massive. 45,000 people are directly employed by the port, and it sees 1.3 million tons of freight pass through it every year, as well as you can see the figure of $1.7 billion in direct economic impact on state GDP. And these were taken from a recent study from 2019. And so the question really here is, how much more economic activity can be tied to the port beyond that $1.7 billion direct impact, and how many more jobs can be tied to the port beyond those 45,000 direct employees? So to help kind of frame and further answer that question, I'll turn it over to one of our analysts, Ying.
Yeah, thanks. So in the scenario that we'll be demonstrating today, we are going to study the Port of Savannah, and we are going to first go over the direct economic impact, not only on the local economy, but also in the surrounding regions where industries and businesses also use the port. And then we are going to focus on the access increase caused by the port, because the port plays an important role in imports and exports. And as industries and businesses import materials from other countries, they will be able to lower their production cost. So that will generate some positive economic impact, and we'll be going over those as well. For model inputs, there are two major components. The first is the commodity access, which captures the ability to import materials from other regions and or other countries. So we are going to increase the commodity access index for all industries in Georgia, and the percent change is estimated using the National Input-Output Matrix. The second component is the employment. We are going to use the industry employment policy variable to first put in the direct employment by the Port of Savannah, and then in other regions in Georgia, we are also going to add in the jobs that are directly related to port activities. And the data is also from this report. And now I will turn it over to Jeff to do the model demonstration. Thank you.
Thanks, Ying. Yeah, so I'm going to, let me share my screen first. I think, here we go. Yeah, everyone should be able to see the model now. So right here I have the inputs. So as we mentioned, we have the direct port employment, as well as the accessibility that the port provides. So it's important to capture both of those impacts. First, before I go over the results in the model, I'm going to pull up the calculations that we did for calculating how much access that port provides. So here we have the, this is the input-output table. So it's showing all industries and how much they demand from every other industry. So our goal is to find out what the access of water transportation is specifically, because the water transportation has to do with the port. So the first step is finding the total, the sum of the IO columns for the transportation, all the transportation industries. So air transportation, rail transportation, all the way through support activities for transportation. So this just shows the total amount of transportation that each industry demands. And then, so we're doing that for each industry. So this 2.3% is just for forestry, 1.1% support activities for agriculture, all the way through all 70 industries within the model. We then multiplied that by the output. This is the total output for the US. And then we get this equals the transportation output demanded by the entire US for each specific industry. The next step is to do the same thing except for water transportation. So we're finding out how much demand in billions of dollars is from each industry to the water transportation industry. And then we then sum up the total transportation demand, total water transportation demand, and this number here, the water transportation divided by the total transportation demand. This is a good indicator of what the port is responsible for, because the port is where the water transportation is in Georgia. So this water transportation divided by the total transportation demand is showing us that about 1.4% of total transportation demand comes from water transportation, which is that which would be classified as that port. So we're using this as the input into our model. So let me open up this simulation here. Before we get into the accessibility increase coming from that port, we'll look at the direct port employment first. So if I edit inputs here, just to show the direct impact. So in Savannah specifically, we have 45,000 direct jobs, port jobs. And then the rest of Georgia, 170,249. And these numbers come from the Georgia Port Study, so we're just taking those directly from there and putting them into the model here. And then once I already ran this, but yeah, so we won't have to run that again. It's a pretty big model, 43 regions. So just to show the impact here, we'll look at employment and GDP. And I over here, I created a favorites group here. So it's a quick way to, maybe if you're running several simulations, you can, and there are a couple indicators that you go back and forth using. it's pretty useful to be able to add them to this favorites category. So we'll look at differences, and we can see that the direct employment causes an impact of about 540,000 jobs, leveling off at around 500,000 for the long term. The GDP impact is around 40 billion, and it grows slightly throughout time. So this is employment and GDP. Now we'll look at everything together. So employment along with the access that the port provides. So we'll look at the inputs first. So we have the same employment here, direct jobs, commodity access index. We have that 1.48% increase. We're using the commodity access index policy variable. And then this is already run. So we'll look at the results. And then again, we'll go to the favorites and employment and GDP. Differences. Yeah, so this shape of this is a little, it increases more throughout time. So you can see how the accessibility from the port has done this. So we go from around 550,000 jobs all the way to this is about 640,000 jobs by 2050. And then the GDP is starts around $40 billion going to 76 billion. And then, so that's employment GDP. We'll also look at the commodity access index. So how the port has provided access to all industries. Look at differences. And then we'll just zoom in here. Construction, couriers and messengers, warehousing and storage, truck transportation. So a lot of transportation related industries, especially, but it benefits pretty much all industries here because all industries rely, at least indirectly, on an efficient transportation system. So then let's look at next output by industry. We can see how the employment and the increased access affects this. So similar impacts to the commodity access index, construction, transportation, retail trade, wholesale trade. They depend a lot on transportation, telecommunications. And then next we'll look at the employment and GDP impact, but specifically if we want to look at the impact from the access specifically. So right now we have differences from the standard regional control, but if instead we want to see how much of this is coming from the access itself, we can change the baseline from the standard regional control to we'll select a different comparison forecast. So we click modify forecast list, and then we want to make the baseline direct port employment or the comparison forecast. So basically it'll take this simulation and subtract that employment coming from the direct employment impact, or the results coming from the direct employment impact. So select, instead of saying regional control, direct port employment, so we can see the impact of impact on employment and GDP from that increased port access. So this is a pretty substantial impact. It goes all the way up to 135,000 jobs by 2050, and GDP of about 16 billion. So the access pretty much compounds through time. So the more access, the more employment and GDP that are created each year, even though we have that constant 1.4% increase in accessibility. So you can see how that compounds over time. So that's it for the simulations. So let's see. I think Carson, did you have anything? I think we're going back to you.
Yeah, certainly. Let me show my screen. I may have to make myself a presenter. Great. So yeah, in conclusion, as you can see through our model demonstration, ports are a major driver of economic activity in a region, not just through direct spending and employment, but because they allow for increased access to commodities, enabling additional industries, factories, and jobs. Raw materials are necessary for jobs in things like battery and solar industries, and these industries would be unviable if not for the existence of these ports. So it's critical that ports are able to both understand and convey the direct and indirect impacts of their infrastructure, so that they can make the investments they need to maximize their returns 5, 10, 20, 50 years down the line. So yeah, thank you for coming to our presentation.